Greetings. Let me start by welcoming you all very warmly. I'm happy to see so many people online and here in the room with us. And I would like to start by very warmly welcoming you to the permanent mission of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. As you know, we're 4 countries, 1 kingdom. Which is relevant because this afternoon we're not only talking about protection of civilians, or maybe a different dimension, but also about an ICJ advisory opinion on climate change and the rights of people. It's actually about human rights. So it is about protection of people, and as most of my countries below sea level, that is relevant. So I would like to start by thanking our strategic partners. Non-violent peace force, the Center for Civilians in Conflict, PACS, for co-organizing this event, together with our co-hosts and co-sponsors. This is the 3rd edition of our POC Week side event on civilian-centered approaches to protection, which is important because sometimes we tend to lose sight of, we are so busy trying to understand the geopolitics of everything that we lose sight of the civilian aspects and our own humanity itself. In the past 2 editions, we have explored why civilian-centered approaches matter and what they look like in different contexts. Today, the aim is to move from the what and the why towards the how of community-led protection. So we want to discuss concrete examples and best practices and what it takes to sustain them in the current moment. Because we all know this moment is a very difficult one. The human toll of conflict remains severe in 2025. And as noted in this year's Secretary General's report on the protection of civilians, approximately 1 civilian was killed every 14 minutes. Let that sink in. Every 14 minutes. Fatalities reached record levels across almost all groups, including humanitarian and healthcare workers and journalists. This is happening precisely when financial resources and institutional capacity are under pressure. Budgets are shrinking, missions are drawing down, and donor engagement is declining. The theme of this year's POC Week, how to ensure protection of civilians amid reforms and constraints, is therefore both timely and urgent. And in these conditions, it's more important than ever that we listen carefully to those that are doing protection work every day, often with very little support. Throughout the POC Week, many statements, calls for action, and events remain rather top-down and largely centered on states and parties to the conflict. And local perspectives truly add to these debates. They remind us of where protection happens every day and what it really requires. And that is why we are genuinely looking forward to being joined today by colleagues from Sudan, South Sudan, and Yemen. My compliments are to the co-organizers for including local partners who can share their stories with us directly. Let me be clear. Centering community-led protection is not about shifting responsibility away from states to the UN. Their responsibility to protect civilians remains absolute. It is about recognizing what communities are already doing, often invisibly and in great personal risk, and asking how we, as member states, UN actors and partners, can better understand, resource, and stand alongside them. Their voices should be heard in this conversation. And I will underline this again during my intervention at the UN Security Council later today. So I will finish here and yield the floor to the experts in the room and online. The Kingdom of Netherlands looks forward to supporting ways to promote and strengthen the use of unarmed civilian-led approaches, both in policy and in practice. And I'm wishing everyone a very constructive discussion. Thank you. And there's place here in front.
There are seats in the front for those who are coming in. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you. We appreciate the Netherlands' continued partnership on this topic and your generosity in hosting us for the 3rd year in a row. So indeed, as the Ambassador has said, a number of us have been organizing and creating space for civilian voices during POC Week for the past 3 years. And we're particularly happy to see that this group of co-sponsoring partners has expanded. So as a reminder, the event today is co-sponsored by the Permanent Mission of the Netherlands, the Permanent Mission of the Democratic Republic of Congo, El Salvador, Panama, the Philippines, FACS, Civic, Ceasefire Center for Civilian Rights, the Humanitarian Policy Group, Air Wars, the Global Protection Cluster, Geneva Call, UNHCR, and UNICEF, and of course, the unarmed Peace Force. So allow me to introduce myself. My name is Iman. For those who don't know me, I'm the representative to the UN for Non-Violent Peace Force, which is a protection of civilians NGO working on non-violent grassroots protection action. I have the pleasure of moderating today's session today for us, and I will start with a few housekeeping rules. First off, interpretation. We arranged for Arabic and French interpretation. You can click for those online in the three dots. You will see more, and you can click on the globe icon where you will see interpretation. Make sure to keep yourselves muted throughout the discussion so as not to disturb the various interventions. And a reminder for myself and everyone here to speak slowly. We have quite a big attendance online, which is great. You're encouraged to put your questions in the chat. And I'm grateful to my colleagues in the room who will help monitor the chat, but also the Q&A in the room. Lastly, we will do our best, and we promise to the delegates for attendance here to finish a little bit early, because we know, of course, that the Security Council is meeting for the open debate on the protection of civilians later today at 10 a.m. So I hope you will help me in keeping remarks short so that we can finish early and people can sprint over to the council chamber. So before I hand over to our wonderful speakers today, I would like to set the scene for us indeed. As the ambassador has said, last year we mostly focused on having, staff members, so protectors, joining in from the field and talking about how they support communities. But this year, it felt particularly important to hear from people themselves, from human beings, from people who are experiencing, violence and navigating it firsthand. And that brings me to sort of the elephant in the room that we, wanted to take a moment and acknowledge here, which is that in the current, climate environment that we're in, the very people that this event centers, and I would argue this week centers, the open debate of the Security Council centers, those who are navigating, impossible situations on the daily, are not here with us, and their absence deserves to be named and to be reckoned with. It reflects crucial conversations and reflections that need to be had about the inclusivity of these spaces and of humanitarian conversations. So everything that we will hear, everything that we will do, everything that we will discuss this morning flows from this commitment that is demonstrated by those who are first and foremost affected and in the conflicts that we discuss. Another thing that I would like to mention at the onset, and that feels especially important in the current UN space of shrinking political will and a difficulty to uphold basic international norms, is that this event is not at all about circumventing the responsibility of states to protect their own populations. It is very clear that that responsibility is absolute and that it is not up for debate. What this event is about is what happens in the gaps, what happens in the many places in the world where that responsibility is not being met for various reasons. And so the premise of the event is very simple. It is that people know what they need to stay safe. And the guiding question throughout the conversation is, how can we, as external partners, be more attentive to those efforts, be more inclusive of them, and what needs to change for us to be? So enough from me. Moving on to our speakers, I will hand over to our first speaker, who is joining us from in Sudan. It's Alawiya Abdallah Haron. Alawiya is a member of the Women Protection Team in Tawila. For those who are unfamiliar with Sudan, Tawila is one of the most volatile areas of North Sudan, where ongoing violence and mass displacement have left communities with very little institutional protection. Alawiya is one of amongst millions of civilians who had to flee the town of El Fasher to Tawila in April last year. As I said, she's a member of the Women Protection Team, which is essentially a group that some groups that Non-Violent Peace Force supports in Sudan that are voluntary based and draw on women's associations, youth groups, religious leaders, and other civil society voices to monitor threats and coordinate local responses. So Alawiyah joined us from Tawila to speak today about what her journey was like as she was fleeing from Al-Fashir to Tawila, the decisions that she had to make and the ones that her communities had to make to stay safe en route, but also the specific risks that women face during the flight and still do as they took refuge in Tawila. So handing over to you, Azahar and Alawiyah. Can you hear us? Great. I think you can unmute yourself and feel free to. You're muted, Azahar.
You hear me, Imanana?
Yes, I can hear you.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أنا علوية. أريد أن أحدثكم ما حدث النزوح من أثناء النزوح من معسكر زمزم إلى فاشر إلى طويلة في إبريل 2025، وكيف تمكنا من البقاء على قيد الحياة وحماية أنفسنا على بعد وصلنا على طويلة برات الأمان في وسط عنف فظيع دون أي دعم خارجي. كنت أعيش سابقا في معسكر زمزم. بدأ الخسف في المعسكر، فحفرنا الخنادق الأرضية لتقليل الإصابات والجروح. حين بدأ الهجوم لم يكن لدينا كثير من الزمن، فجمعنا الأطفال وكبار السن وفرينا سيرا على الأقدام نحو طويلة لمدة 3 أيام متتالية. كانت الرحلة قصيرة جديد بدون ماء وأكل. كان معظمنا ربات البيوت وكثير مننا عرامل. كثير مننا أرامل وسرنا كان قبل الحرب متفككين قبل الفرار. فحين تحركنا كان كل مننا يتحمل مسؤولية الأطفال وكبار السن دون أن نجد من نعتمد إليه. حينما وصلنا على طويلة فجمعنا الأطفال الداعيين وجمعناهم مع أسرهم، وبعض منهم فقد والديه، فكونا مجموعات لتحديد هوية الأطفال وجمعهم مع تبقى من أهلهم. بسبب القصف الشديد في الفاشر قرر بعضنا على الرجوع على الفاشر لتحذير ما بقى في الفاشر ومساعدتهم على لم شملة مع أهلهم في طويلة وتزويدهم بالمعلومات التي يحتاجونها لاتخاذ مخاطرة القرار. في 2022 تدربنا على الحماية المدنية غير المسلحة، وتخرجنا في 2023 قبل اندلاع الحرب. كانت التدريب في التحكم على الإشاعات وقضايا العنف الجنسي وحماية الطفل وحماية المجتمع وحل النزاعات والإنذار المبكر والاستجابة المبكرة. هذا التدريب ساعدنا على أن نشتغل مع بعض السلطات المحلية والجهات الفعالة وكيف أن نكون لحل مشاكلنا. كل ذلك ساعدنا استخدام الإنذار المبكر، حفرنا الخنادق ورهنا الأطفال وكبار السن ومرافقتهم. استخدمنا شبكات لتبادل المعلومات وتوزيع الأدوار لنحمي بعضنا أثناء النزول. أريد أن أعطيكم مثال واحد عن الحماية التي تقودها المجتمع على الأرض الواقع، لأنها ليست فقط لمساعدة أثناء الطوارئ. بعد وصلنا على طويلة انتشر حرائق شديد انتشر حرائق شديد لأن النساء يخرجن في صباح الباكر ليجلبون المساعدات ويتركون الأطفال ليعيدون الطعام بأنفسهم ويلعبون بالنيران. في مرة أحرقت فيه 900 منزل ومات فيه طفل. قمنا عملنا منتدى أمني مجتمعي، جمعنا القيادات المحليين وأبناء المجتمع، عملنا حل لتوعية. ساعدنا الأسر على التفكير في الطرق أكثر أمانا للمطبخ، وساعدنا الأسر على إعادة البناء بالطوب. إنه التكافل هو ما نملكه. أيضا ساعدنا على رفع الوعي على النساء الذين يتعرضن على الاغتصاب والتحرش التي تعرضنا لها جلب الحطب ومواد البناء. ليس لدينا إلا الخروج. كل واحد مننا لديه أسرة، لأنها إذا ترك وراه وطلع مشى الخلا، لو ما مشيت الخلا يعني تتعرض على الخطر أكتر، لأنه المساعدة ما بتكون كافية، على أساس إنه نترك الأطفال ونمشي الخلا والمخاطر تلحقنا في كل مكان. في مكان المساعدات وتوزيع إغاثة. والنساء لدينا استغلال جنسي مقابل الحصول على المساعدات. ليس لدينا مساحات آمنة لمشاركة مخاوف الحماية، وندعم بعضنا البعض. ونحتاج أيضا إلى المزيد من الناس على الحماية الذاتية، لأن التدريب مستدام في الطويل الآن والمساعدات الإنسانية في حياة الناس، لكن لا توجد للناجين من العنف مساعدات ولا مساعدات قانونية لمحاسبة المجرمين. أعلم أنكم هذا الأسبوع في نيويورك لمناقشة حماية المدنيين. نتمنى أن تسمعوا هذا. استثمروا فينا، دربوا مزيد من الناس على أرض الواقع، وأمنوا للنساء مساحات آمنة للاجتماعات والتعبير، وحاسبوا من استقلنا من المساحات، وشاركونا ليست كمستفيدات بل شاركونا للحلول. والسلام عليكم.
Thank you so much, Alawiya. A very clear call to action here about taking one's cue and leadership from communities and listening to what the people who are on the ground are saying about what they need to keep themselves safe and how they prioritize their own needs. I want to move to our next speaker, James Gadbani, who is a member of the Community Security Committee in, I tried to rehearse saying this name multiple times, Painja, a city in southern Unity States in South Sudan, and a partner of the organization PAX. I'm grateful to our partners at PAX for making my facilitation job much easier, because the questions are actually screened within the video, the pre-recorded videos. So welcoming you all to watch the message from James.
My name is James Gadbani Mashok. I work as a field consultant with the PAX Protection of Civilians program in South Sudan, focusing on Unity states. Our program works with communities affected by conflict with present civilian protection through research, dialogues, peace building, and local mediations. In simple terms, we listen to communities, understand the risks they face, and support them to develop their own local solution for safety and peace. The civilian-focused approach means that protection starts from the everyday experience of ordinary people. In practice, we begin by listening to communities to understand their main security concerns. From there, we support local dialogue, earlier warning system, and mediation process that help prevent violence before it escalates. In Lake and Unity State of South Sudan, for example, civilians face a number of serious challenges. These include intercommunal tension over pasture and water, cattle raidings, revenge killing, gender-based violence, and forces merits. These issues are often connected, and they affect both people, safety, and their livelihoods. Our work is based on grassroots research, community dialogue, peace education, and engagement with local leaders. We also support community-led protection, a structure that help identify risks earlier and respond before violence happens. As part, our local approach is working with voluntary committees known as COMSECOM. In full, COMSECOM stands for Community Security Committees. These communities are comprised of representatives from youth, women, chiefs, IDPs, and youth. Their role are to implement community security priorities, such as mediation, resolution local conflict, promoting peaceful coexistence, and sharing information. We make sure that women, youth, marginalized groups are included in discussion and decision making. We also create safe space where everyone can speak freely and be heard equally. We have seen communities independently organize peace dialogues, resolve cattle-related disputes, and improve earlier warnings communication. These successes are mainly driven by trust, strong local ownership, and continual dialogue within the community. Over time, communities become more resilient and less dependent on external actors. Local peace structure continue to function even in remote areas where international presence is limited. It is also important to respect local custom while encouraging peaceful solution. We face ongoing insecurity, limited resources, difficult access to remote areas, and cycle of revenge violence that are very difficult to break. People unfamiliar with South Sudan should understand that the everyday reality of working in places like Lake and Unity State in South Sudan is extremely challenging and complex. Another important reality is that insecurity is unpredictable. A place may appear calm today and become tense tomorrow due to cattle dispute, revenge attack, or political misunderstanding. Civil society organization continuously work to build trust, maintain neutrality, and support peaceful dialogue among communities. Despite these risks, at the same time, communities in South Sudan remain resilient despite the challenges. Civil society actors often work in very fragile conditions with limited support and civic space, and yet they are expected to fill gaps left by weak institutions. The UN should stay closely connected to realities on the ground and ensure that protection strategies are driven from communities themselves. Therefore, the UN should embrace, support, and empower the local actors for sustainability of peace and protection of civilians. If UNIMIS reduce its presence, it could increase vulnerability, especially in remote areas where local protection systems are still fragile. It may also weaken substantive confidence of people and limit the support for local peace actors to continue carrying out awareness on peace and protection issues. What the UN should learn from our experience of protecting civilians is that our intervention is bottom-up approach, which has produced positive impact and is entirely community-driven. Thank you very much, and may God bless you. Bye-bye.
May God bless you, as James has just said. Unfortunately, he cannot join us live, so we won't be able to direct any questions to him later. But I think his call to action was equally as clear. One, to listen to communities, to make sure, that as external actors, we have a humble posture. We understand the realities and we understand the priorities that will guide our support. Moving on to the next speaker, Marwan El-Shari, who's the head of Aden Foundation for Rights and Development. Marwan leads a South Yemen-based organization focused in security sector issues and youth empowerment. He works alongside young people in Al-Dali Governorate in southern Yemen to build civic engagement and conflict resolution from ground up in a place where formal institutions offer little protection. Checking if Marwan is joined us live and is on the Zoom. Thankfully, we have contingency plans, just as when peacekeeping missions. So we will be screening a pre-recorded video that Marwan kindly recorded for us in order to share some messages in the room.
أستاذ مروان الشاعري رئيس مؤسسة عدن للحقوق والتنمية عن دور الشباب في حماية المدنيين وبناء السلام. أستاذ مروان، لقد عملت بشكل مكثف مع شبكات الشباب ومبادرات المساطرة، ما الدور الذي يمكن تخفيف حدة توترات الاجتماع؟
Let's start over, maybe.
نظرا لقدرة المباشر للمجتمعات وبناء الثقة والاستجابة تم تأسيس المنتدى السياسي والحقوق للشباب كمنصة شبابية لتعزيز دور الشباب وبناء الثقة. وقد نفذ المنتدى العديد من اللقاءات الحوارية ودعم بناء ورفع الوعي الحقوقي كما ساهم في طريق حل النزاعات وحماية المدنيين في محافظة الطالع، والذي لعب دورا مهما في الوساطة المحلية واحتوى وحماية. يعمل المنتدى حاليا على التحضير لإطلاق حملة شباب الطالع كمساحة شبابية تركز على الحماية والتمكين والتنمية والحوكمة وتعزيز مشاركة الشباب في جهود السلام والاستقرار المجتمعي.
So we're trying to find a solution so that we can hear the English version. Is it okay if we stop the video and then we hear the interpreters? The interpret consecutively? Yeah. Let's try that out.
نرحب بالأستاذ مروان الشاعري رئيس مؤسسة حماية المدنيين وبناء السلام. أستاذ مروان، لقد عملت بشكل مكثف مع شبكات مبادرات المساطرة. هذه العمل حماية المدنيين.
Can the interpreters hear us? Forward with the program, and then as soon as we're able to locate Marwan on the Zoom, we can come back to him later. So we wanted to start this program with a dedicated time to hear from people who are joining us from the field, as we were saying, leading on grassroots protection action, and then moving to our responsibility as external actors here in this room. We have ideas, we have inspirations about what people-centered and informed protection systems can look like. And now we turn our attention to our collective responsibility as humanitarians, as academics, or as the diplomatic international community. We know that at the international level, goals are shaped by political and institutional structures. So now the question, becomes what is required of armed actors, of UN structures, of humanitarians. What does accountability and leverage look like, especially in this current moment? And to take the language from the concept note of this week's POC discussions, in a moment of constraints and reforms, which I think we all know is more than a euphemism. So for that, I want to move to our sort of panel segment and invite our first speaker, May Thompson, who is the Senior Advocacy Officer at Ceasefire Center for Civilian Rights. May, when militaries, including peacekeepers, come into contact with civilians, often what we hear is that they are insufficiently aware of the risks and unintended consequences that their proximity to local residents can cause. So what can member states do to better understand and respond to those dangers?
Thank you, Iman. Can you hear me?
We're just going to raise the volume a little.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Brilliant.
And the volume so people can. Go ahead, Nick.
Thank you. And I'm very grateful to be part of this event. As Aurelia and James have powerfully made clear, even under the most difficult circumstances, civilians are building effective systems to protect their communities. And in Ceasefire's advocacy with states and with institutions, we work to ensure that the voices of those most affected by conflict are heard. Yet often we encounter what's already been highlighted today, that the people living through conflict are left out of discussions that shape the systems that are meant to protect them. One of the spaces where this disconnect is most pronounced is at the intersection between civilians and militaries. And with the world more volatile and more states becoming directly involved in conflict, it's important to consider what member states can do to protect civilians during their own military operations as part of broader efforts to advance the UN's POC agenda. And this is because, as you mentioned, in all situations where militaries come into contact with civilians, there are dangers that are not always sufficiently anticipated and understood. A clear example is when civilians are in close proximity to military objectives. Civilians are harmed not only by violations of the IHL principles of distinction and proportionality, but also by so-called lawful attacks, or because they might be in the vicinity of military targets which come under attack from adversaries. And militaries do not always take defensive precautions to anticipate this, nor do they always prevent, understand, or address the direct or reverberating harm they cause. In the context of peacekeeping, missions can be a cause of harm for the civilian population. This has been seen in the introduction of cholera into Haiti by UN peacekeepers and in the long history of sexual exploitation and abuse reportedly committed by peacekeepers in many countries, an issue that persists despite measures introduced to tackle misconduct. And in many instances, early allegations raised by victims are not acted upon. The involvement of militaries in the delivery of humanitarian outcomes may also carry serious and sometimes deadly risks for civilians, including aid workers. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's aid distribution model, which undermined humanitarian principles, created concentrations of vulnerable IDPs, and forced them to be in close proximity to armed actors, is a stark warning. And in all of these contexts, stronger dialogue between military and civilian actors can help ensure that militaries are more attuned and better equipped to respond to the risks civilians face, the harms they experience, and their actual needs. And I can briefly highlight 3 principles that we believe should guide this. First, civilian voice must be channeled in a structured, institutional way, rather than solely through ad hoc or informal mechanisms that fail to generate sustained and meaningful engagement. Second, the opportunity to engage must be accessible and inclusive. Conflict is experienced differently by different parts of the community, and vulnerable and marginalized groups often face additional barriers to sharing their knowledge and perspectives. And UN country offices, as well as local and international NGOs, can play a vital role in facilitating this. And third, consultation must not place additional burdens or risks on civilians. In many conflict scenarios, engagement of any kind with conflict actors can place civilians at risk of perceived complicity and vulnerable to revenge attacks. So communication channels, therefore, must be designed with full awareness of these sensitivities. And ultimately, member states and their institutions must recognize civilians as active agents capable of monitoring conflict, documenting harm, building systems of self-protection, and articulating their needs. Protection efforts are far more likely to fail when they are designed and implemented in the absence of the people that they are intended to protect. Effective protection begins with listening to communities living through conflict, treating their knowledge, experiences, perspectives as essential rather than peripheral, and ensuring that institutional protection and civilian harm mitigation efforts reinforce community-led initiatives to reduce harm and promote accountability.
Thank you, May. I think it's a great compliment indeed to the local perspectives that we were hearing earlier about our responsibility to be inclusive in the community, voices in the ways in which we, plan our external engagements, our external interventions. Moving to our only in-person speaker, thank you for keeping me company. So Megan Carlo Pedersen, who's the policy specialist at Airwars. So Megan, the testimonies we heard indeed make very concrete local threats. Airwars works at the other end of that picture, which is documenting what armed actors are actually doing versus what they say they do. So in a moment when oversight and accountability mechanisms are being cut, where do you see the most dangerous gaps, and what would it take for military and mission planners to make local civil society integration into civilian harm mitigation and response the norm rather than the exception?
Thank you very much. Thank you first of all to the Permanent Mission of the Netherlands for hosting us, and also to my fellow speakers, especially Abelia and James, for sharing your perspectives in a really compelling way. And as you mentioned, I work for Airwars. We're an NGO based in London, focused on monitoring, assessing, and archiving allegations of harm, looking at civilians' own testimonies. So the way that we do it is to look at open source information, including photos, videos, and testimonies by those who've been affected to understand the way in which civilians are affected by explosive weapons and violent warfare. And I was asked to speak to this gap between what armed actors are setting out to do and what they do in practice. And I think one of the key things we've seen happen across all the conflicts we're monitoring is this gap that's happening between the evidence that's presented by civilians of armed violence and the ability, or in some cases the willingness, of the armed actors to listen to what's being said and what the evidence is showing. And when the evidence isn't taken into account by those in power, it degrades the agency of those civilians who are working hard to document the harm that they're experiencing. And in effect, the way that we see it is there's really three things we need to understand in order to take into account civilians' perspective in an effective way. So the first one is understanding how civilians describe their own.
The sound is not here for interpreters, maybe a little bit slower.
Okay. Yeah. Should I move the microphone or should I just speak slower?
Yeah.
Just speak back. Okay, I will do. So the first thing that we see of these three things we just done, understanding how civilians describe their own harm. And I mean that both in terms of the language that we use across different cultures to talk about harm and to explain the kind of experiences they're having, but also the culturally significant way that harm often reverberates in very different ways in different cultures. So it's understanding the ways that civilians see their own harm is the first step. The second thing is understanding where civilians report their harm. So again, there's very different aspects to this in different cultures. In some, we see that civilians are very focused on documenting their own harm and sharing the evidence on local and social media. And in others, there's more focus on resharing what local institutions or local governments have themselves provided. And so those looking for evidence should really be looking to go to civilians for where they are reporting harm, as opposed to expecting civilians to come to them. And the third is understanding what kind of evidence civilians are documenting and reporting. This could be anything from videos and photos of civilians who've been harmed or killed. It can also be evidence of buildings that have been destroyed or munition remnants. So again, understanding these different parts of the puzzle and how they fit together That's a really important way of understanding the disability voice. As we see it, it's really vital that states and such institutions have the systems to gather this information, because reviewing open source information is a resilient model of understanding what is happening to civilians in their own words. Whether there are budget constraints or political pressure, civilians continue to provide evidence and document what's happening to them. We see that even in environments where actors are attempting to limit the ability to do this. We see it in Gaza, where there is over 20 incidents on average, or over 20 sources per incident on average, of people documenting the harm they're experiencing. We see it in Yemen, where there are constraints from military groups trying to restrict civilians' ability to document harm, and still they are doing so. And most recently, we've seen it in Iran, where there's closing down of the internet, but again, there is evidence available of civilians documenting their own harm. And so the risk isn't so much to do with civilians' ability to document their own harm, but more the ability of international institutions and militaries to listen to what is being said by the civilians. I think in some ways, taking civilians' voices into account can be part of addressing this upheaval. So first of all, because the response part of civilian harm mitigation and response isn't just about responding to the harm that's already occurred, but really looking at the patterns of harm that are identified and broken. So doing that by looking at the evidence of what is already causing harm. And secondly, as we've heard throughout POC week already, I think so much of the challenge is to do with political will. And really the biggest way to kind of challenge that lack of political will, the political apathy, is to rehumanize those who've been affected by modern warfare by taking into account their own voices and their own documentation of harm.
Thank you. The call to rehumanizing, I think, is something that is very central to each of our organizations' work, and something that we definitely wanted to be a key takeaway of this event. So thank you, Megan. Moving to Elisabetta, we wanted to bring in a UN perspective to this discussion. So Elisabetta works at the Division of International Protection and Solutions at UNHCR. Elisabetta, as the UN's Refugee Agency and as the ISC Global Protection Cluster Lead, UNHCR works in many of the same contexts we heard from today, from Sudan, South Sudan, Yemen, and more, and sits in forums where the protection architecture gets designed and discussed. As the overall humanitarian architecture is being reformed and as budgets contract, what does a more responsive partnership with local civil society look like from where you sit, and what are potential systemic challenges and opportunities to foster that equal partnership?
Thank you very much. Sorry, it took me the 5 seconds to unmute. Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizer, and thank you particularly for the colleagues from South Sudan, for sharing their experiences. And I think that these testimonies remind us of really this reality that protection starts with communities locally, every day, rooted in presence, in proximity, but also in trust, and that communities are not passive recipients, but they are first responders. And of course, they need to be supported in cooperation and in coordination with the humanitarian actors that have, and states that have at least the duty to observe IHL principle not to harm them. For UNHCR and the Global Protection Cluster, the discussion today really highlights the question that is not so much how to bring protection to the community, but how to recognize and further enable what already exists as what already exists, and how to further support people protecting people. And there are maybe 3 points that I would like to highlight in terms of a more responsible partnership. The first is that we need to move from consultation to co-leadership. We really need to move beyond the simple consulting community, and we need to systematically including local actors in decision-making, including in clusters or in sectors, including in humanitarian country teams and in other platforms where strategic discussions are being made, including our own agencies and our programming. Second, we also need to shift this decision-making to the more localized spaces and platforms that already exist. And this is why access and presence is important, even for us, for international humanitarian. I put international in quote. The third point is to engage and resourcing local organizations and as strategic partners, and not only just as an implementer, and be willing to make shift within our own systems and our own process. This is the first point. The second is to move from parallel system to complementarity. We heard it from South Sudan. We need to understand better, we need to engage better, and we need to invest. And as much as possible, we need to co-design delivery with communities and community-based organization and avoid parallel system because this just overlooks or duplicates what already exists, and invest in community structures and not substitute them. And we have good example already that the protection cluster in countries and at global level, other humanitarian actor, UNHCR promotes. We have community centers managed by community committees composed of displaced and host communities. This is happening in Bangladesh. In Darfur, we heard the Tawila colleagues. We have network of community reach out volunteers that are providing information and identify civilians in need and refer those civilians to services. And we have community structures such as women groups or women-led organization. We heard Hazer that were already engaging in gender-based violence prevention, in risk mitigation, in well-being of children. And then the third point is to shift from short-term contracting to predictable support. We really need, and in order to support community, we need multi-year flexible and accessible funding directly going to local organizations. I mean, UNHCR has tried to move in this direction. Currently in 2025, we have 71% of UNHCR funding, partners funding are going to civil society organization, national civil society organization. And we did try to include dedicated funding mechanism for grassroots and non-registered organization. There are the country-based pool funding. They are great opportunity, but we must be preserving this and build on these gains. You asked about the challenges. And to be very honest, in the context of shrinking budgets and short-term implementation frameworks, we believe that there is a real risk, and we saw it, and the Global Protection Cluster has done an analysis on this, that there is a real risk that community-based protection becomes the first area that is being deprioritized. And this impedes outreach, this impedes presence, this impedes engagement and partnership with communities. As I said, the Global Protection Cluster has been tracking the impacts of the recent funding cuts and have seen that, unfortunately, the most acute, or among the most acute retrenchment and losses are exactly in frontline protection programs and frontline staff. And this put in jeopardy the gains that has so far been reached. So what is the way forward in the current humanitarian landscape? I mean, there is a moment of reform, and this reform needs to become not only a bureaucratic reform, but really making localization real and operational. We think that there are, with the localization, the empowered country leadership and the more streamlined architecture, we can provide a better platform to rebalance these partnerships. But this needs, again, to translate in direct funding support and in more collaborative decision-making. The systematic inclusion of local protection leaders and organizations in decision-making spaces at operational and at global level, it's really a necessity. And at the same time, this coordination must have the courage to devolve. And in practice, this means for humanitarian country teams to have a strong contingent of national NGO members. For the consolidated protection cluster to have much more national and community-based organization as key members, not only of their core, of the key participants of the meetings, but really key members in their strategic advisory groups and in their coordination teams. And at the global level, we still really need to actively include people with lived experience, for example, through advisory boards that exist and that have a great value. And these are a kind of a minimum upon which we can build. We need simplified partnership procedure and also more accessible funding modalities, because there are too many transaction barriers and accessibility barriers to funds for local organizations. And this is maybe a message to states. And then we need also more collegial initiative to build institutional capacity for local actor on managing financial system, on inclusive programming, on project management. We heard also the good training that were provided to some of the community organization. And this needs to become more coordinated. For example, those joint training to become eligible for country-based pool funding, these are great opportunities. So at the end of the day, the progress will really depend on whether we are willing to shift policies, we are willing to shift power, and opportunities, because only in this way we can enable really those who face the protection risk to shape and lead the responses. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I was tempted to cut you off for time reasons, but you had such a inspiring list of recommendations for the room. I think what you made a very excellent and key point about essentially, all of this boiling down to political will and political courage to keep protection and the lives of those who are facing, severe violence at the heart of the international system and the decisions that we are making. We speak of, budget cuts, we speak of contraction, financial contraction, but those are the results of political decisions. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind and in focus. Protection doesn't have to be disinvested. Communities' voices don't have to be neglected. Those are the results of the choices that many of us here are making or contributing to make. So before we go into the interactive segment, we were able to locate Marwan. Marwan, thank you for joining us. If I could ask you to keep your comments very brief so that we can keep the time, but I want to go back to you to be able to tell us a little bit about the work that you've been leading in Yemen and what you want the people in this room to take away. Over to you, Marwan. I think you're on mute.
أوكي. أصحاب السعادة السيدات السادة، في البداية أود أن أتقدم خالص الشكر والتقدير للسعادة السفير الغزاء على هذه الاستضافة الجلسة المهمة، كما أتوجه بالشكر لسيدي إيمان ومنظمة الأعمال للسلام على إتاحة هذه المساحة لإيصال أصوات المجتمعات المحلية من مناطق النزاع إلى هذا المنبر الدولي. إن الاستماع إلى أصوات العاملين على الأرض وإلى المجتمعات التي تعيش النزاع بشكل يومي يحمل أهمية كبيرة، خاصة في ظل عالم أصبحت فيه معاناة المدنيين تختزل أحيانا في أرقام وتقارير، بينما تبقى قصة الصمود والعمل المجتمعي بعيدة عن دوائر القرار. في بلدي وبعد أكثر من 10 سنوات من الحرب، ما تزال المجتمعات المحلية تتحمل أعباء هائلة في ظل استمرار النزاع وتراجع الخدمات الأساسية وضعف المؤسسات إنفاذ القانون، خصوصا في مناطق التماس مثل محافظة الضالع. وفي مثل هذه الواقع لم يكن أمام المجتمعات المحلية خيار سوى أن تتحمل مسؤولية حماية نفسها والحفاظ على الحد الأدنى من التماسك والاستقرار المجتمعي. ومن خلال عملنا ضمن مجموعة الحماية المجتمعية التابعة لمنظمة سيفيك في عدن، لمسنا كيف يمكن للشباب أن يتحولوا من جيل متأثر بالحرب إلى قوة فاعلة في حماية المدنيين وصناعة السلام داخل بيئة شديدة التعقيد. فمنذ عام 2021 عملت مجموعة الحماية المجتمعية على تنفيذ تدخلات ميدانية ركزت على حماية المدنيين وتعزيز الحوار المجتمعي وبناء قنوات تواصل مع السلطات الأمنية والعسكرية، بما ساهم في الحد من الانتهاكات وتعزيز الاستجابة للشكاوي المجتمعية ودعم سيادة القانون. كما لعب الشباب دورا محوريا في هذه الجهود، سواء عبر الرصد والتوثيق أو بناء الثقة بين المجتمع والأجهزة الأمنية أو التدخل لاحتواء التوتر المحلي، إضافة إلى إطلاق حملات مجتمعية للحد من انتشار السلاح والتوعية بمخاطر العنف المجتمعي. وفي هذا السياق جاء تأسيس المنتدى السياسي والحقوقي للشباب كمنصة شبابية تهدف إلى تعزيز مشاركة الشباب في قضايا الحماية وبناء السلام. وقد نفذ المنتدى سلسلة من اللقاءات والمبادرات الشبابية التي ركزت على التوعية الحقوقية وتعزيز الحوار المجتمعي ودعم التماسك الاجتماعي داخل المجتمعات المحلية. ومن أبرز المبادرات التي انبثقت عن المنتدى السياسي والحقوقي للشباب تأسيس فريق حل النزاعات وحماية المدنيين في محافظة الضالع، والذي لعب دورا مهما في حماية المدنيين والوساطة المحلية واحتواء التوترات وتسهيل المبادرات الإنسانية والمساهمة الفاعلة في فتح الطرقات الإنسانية. وقد راكم أعضاء فريق الفريق منذ سنوات شبكة واسعة من العلاقات والثقة بين المجتمع المحلي والسلطات المحلية والقيادة الأمنية والعسكرية، الأمر الذي ساعد لاحقا في دعم جهود الوساطة وتهيئة البيئة لفتح الطريق الاستراتيجي الذي يربط بين محافظة عدن والضالع وصنعاء، كما يواصل المنتدى السياسي والحقوقي للشباب للعمل حاليا على التحضير لإطلاق قمة شباب الضالع كمساحة شبابية تركز على الحماية والتمكين والتنمية والحوكمة وتعزيز دور الشباب في الاستقرار وصناعة السلام المحلي. السيدات والسادة، لقد أثبتت التجربة في بلدنا أن الشباب ليسوا مجرد فئة متأثرة بالنزاع، بل يمثلوا شريكا أساسيا في حماية المدنيين وبناء السلام، خصوصا عندما تتوفر لهم المساحة الآمنة والدعم المناسب. ومن واقع تجربتنا فإن مبادرة الشباب Excuse me again.
Thank you, Mahmoud, for what you're sharing. Unfortunately, we cannot use the group to reflect on the segment and ask that you turn to your neighbor, maybe 2 or 3 people, and that you reflect on both the discussions that we've had, but also this question here. So, what would it mean concretely for you, your government or organization, to genuinely listen and respond to these calls from civilians around inclusion, around leadership, including in how funding is allocated and what would have to change for this to be realized? So over to you, turn to your neighbors, meet each other, discuss. You have about 6 minutes and then I will bring the room back together. Make sure you discuss.
Yeah, it's like, just remember when I was in school, I would have to do like, well, I have a very peculiar concept. It's not, I think that we as diplomats always are dealing you don't get
هم طرحوا سؤال حول موضوع الاستدامة كذا.
common reflections around what you've heard. The permanent mission of Panama. Thank you so much, Jack, for being with us here. And I'm handing over the mic to you to share maybe reflections of the sort of side chat that you've just had, but also generally Panama's priorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imane, for all your work. But I would like to thank the Kingdom of Netherlands and Non-Violent Peace for this timely discussion. I was just having a great chat here with my colleague from Sweden. We were talking about two different sides and perspectives from this question. Because when we talk about the protection of civilians, we most of the time talk about the big awards that always are in the media. And of course, we are thinking about wars that are happening and are affecting civilians that comes from professional armies that are trained or are supposed to be trained on these rules and states that have to uphold them. And it's quite important, but also there is something that we learn quite a lot from the global south. And it is not just about a regular war when we see it, but also whenever we have conflicts, as we can see from gangs and from different conflicts, organizations that are just happening in the same issues and are doing the same conflicts that are affecting our countries. And whenever we go there and talk about violence, we often find that these people that are fighting, they don't even understand what is international humanitarian law. They most of the time don't even know what's the national law about protecting civilians or engaging in a conflict or respecting them. So for us, it's also quite important to do, since educational systems try to get there to those people since we were kids, try to reach them, try to make us all understand what is international humanitarian law, what the principles they are, because we don't know. I'm sorry for making this longer, but I can tell from my own example, from my own experience, you never know people that are raised with you, that are your neighbors, that can go into a conflict, that can just take a weapon and lie. So if we tackle this since we were in school, since we were kids, we at least can have in midterms a better perspective for people to understand what it takes, or at least that have a moral limits, that in the end, always protection of civilians is going to be something moral. So thank you very much for having us here. From our perspective from Panama, this is the kind of events that we like to support. And we thank you very much in this busy week to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack. I think you mentioned here something that is key that was mentioned by other speakers as well, which is the reason why we promote sort of civilian agency and civilian centeredness and protection is because one of the key advantages, for lack of a better word, is that we are dealing with people who know first and foremost the local customs, the cultures. They speak the same language as those who might be perpetrators of violence, and that provides for unique access, unique inroads in terms of preventing violence in a certain area. And I think that's that sort of comparative advantage, or that unique positionality, is something that needs to be recognized and continuously. Is there anyone else in the room who would like to share reflections that they've just had in side chats? Maybe, good connections they've made, the good conversations, some points that came up that they would like to share with the wider group. Perfect.
Thank you very much. My name is Alon Abdel. I'm from UNHCR. My colleague spoke. I just want to challenge us. When we look at different conflicts, it could be in Sudan, my own country, from Ethiopia, a number of other countries, communities, in whatever shape and form, they will also be embedded in the conflict dynamics. And so when we talk about protection, I think there has to be also right, the concept of neutrality. And so I don't think we should be completely naive and say these kind of community structures will totally serve the communities. Like, for example, along ethnic lines, we see communities with entrenched animosity competition. And so what are the guardrails that we have, the considerations, the protection mechanisms. And I think this is one important point that we should also consider.
Thank you, Alejandra. I think one thing that you're alluding to that is also very important part of this conversation is sort of not suggesting, as much as we want to center civilian and civilian agency, that we can offload, undue risk to civilians on the ground, and that's a very clear red line that we should all be aware of. You mentioned Sudan. All of us here have heard of, for instance, emergency response rooms in Sudan. As much as we can commend their efforts in keeping each other safe, we also have to reckon with the fact that these are people who have been, sustaining immense levels of stress for 3 years consecutively now. And we still have to, keep front and center that we have a responsibility as people who are not there to make sure that they, get the care that they deserve and the sort of accompaniment that they deserve as they're leading that work on the ground. So before we close the event, because I promised we would close a little bit earlier, I do want to give the opportunity if someone to ask questions to our speakers who are still joining us here online.
Thank you so much. My name is Magnus Collett. I'm Sweden's Special Envoy for Sudan. I'm visiting New York for a couple of days, and I'm very pleased to join this event. I wanted to ask our esteemed colleagues in Tawila about their work. You also mentioned emergency response rooms, and of course the incredible work that they also do locally throughout Darfur in the spirit of Nafir, as we know, in Sudan, which is very important to local communities together. I used to live in Khartoum, and I visited Darfur before the outbreak of war, so I know the immense level of destruction that you and your communities are suffering. And the problem is, of course, that civilians are not collateral damage in the war in Sudan. They are the target from both sides, not only in terms of infrastructure and healthcare facilities and trade routes, but also the systematic and widespread use of sexual violence against women and girls as a weapon of war that you also referred to. And this occurs, unfortunately, primarily along ethnic lines. So I wanted to ask you how your community-based protection approach can be used to achieve any form of accountability for sexual-based violence, and how these structures can also be discussed with local and regional leaders between ethnic communities. And in this case, in Darfur, of course, this would mean further dialogue between the Ford and the Sagawa, the Isriya and the Wisiga tribes, where unfortunately, due to the war, there is severe ethnic division in Sudan at a risk for partition. Thank you.
Thank you. Azahar, over to you.
Thank you. So, yeah, you hear me?
You may still be muted.
So I'm Azahir Amara. I'm National Protection Officer for a Non-Violent Police Force.
Were you able to hear the question?
I'm in the field in Tawila now. In terms of maybe I can repeat the question. He's asked about the protection of with the community leaders.
The question was how the community-based protection groups that you see in Tawila, how those can be used for accountability, for example, against sexual-based or for the sexual-based violence.
As my community protection number, she said, we have the lack of the legal support. This is the first, but sometimes we link them with the authorities just to create some space for them to negotiate and to raise their voice. How we can support the community and how we can accountability. For some authorities, they're listening and also they show how those women and they are willing to support each other, and also there is new something here for the. I'm just here some repeated for my voice. I don't know. This is issue for me or from your side?
We can hear you very well.
Yes, I hear that this interpreter for Arabic. You hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
I need to speak Arabic.
No,
Yes.
no, you can speak in English. We can hear you in English
Okay.
very well.
Okay, that is good. I get my fault. So I stop this interpreter. So sometimes we just link those committee with the authorities. We create space for them to we let them to lead their protection and ask their authorities what we can do as the community and what the responsibility for the authority. So that is the mainly way sometimes we have here to accountability that like perpetrators, but we have the lack of the legal system or legal support for that issue. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Zahir. I think we're going to close the discussion here. I'm not going to attempt to summarize everything, but I definitely want to sort of bring us home with a few takeaways from this discussion. So I think ultimately a lot of the calls that we heard today boil down to one, fact or one call to action, which is whether we are willing to let protection strategies be driven by the people who are experiencing the violence themselves. Whether we are willing to invest in how to better equip, these community-based mechanisms to strategize and organize around local protection architectures. As I've said earlier, I think there's a fine line here to walk, because some may hear this and feel like it implies that, we need to let people fend for themselves, essentially. But it's far from that. A lot of what we heard is also a lot of exhaustion from bearing, protection burden without adequate external support. So two things can be true at the same time. We can have, humility to listen, to understand, and to take our cues from those who hold local knowledge. And we can be serious about our own responsibility and not abdicate our own role as external actors who can and should support. Then the question becomes what that support can look like. And it's, as I said, it's a fine line to walk. It will be context specific. In some instances, it can be, financial support. In some instances, it can be providing political cover to some of those, community-based protection, be it at the national level, at the local level, or at the international level. And also a sort of clear, introspection around where UN or international presence can have real protective impact. Where it can deter violence, and where it may be wiser to step back and find other ways to support. So essentially, invest in local protection action, hold this tension with nuance, have a humble posture, and at the same time hold the responsibility to act, and know your comparative advantage, when to be present, when to step back, and what other forms of solidarity look like. I want to thank everyone for joining us at this event today. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much to our speakers, especially those who joined from afar. I know, unfortunately, some may feel frustrated for not having been able to ask some questions, but I hope that this discussion can continue. We have some food, some coffee in the back, so feel free to stick around. And those who need to head out to the council, I hope you go with those key takeaways in mind. And until we meet again. Thank you.